He stood on the steps of a conquered Paris, arms folded, gazing at the Eiffel Tower as if the entire world was already his. And for a moment, it almost was. But less than 6 years later, that same man was crouched in an underground bunker, trembling, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, while the city above him burned to the ground. How does the most feared military machine in modern history collapse so completely? The answer is not a single battle, not a single mistake. It is a chain of arrogance, delusion, and decisions so catastrophically wrong that they didn't just lose a war. They destroyed an empire, an ideology, and a man who believed he was untouchable. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler lost the Second World War. And it starts not with defeat, but with a handshake between two men who despised each other. It was August 1939, and Europe held its breath. The air over the continent felt thick, electric, like the stillness before a storm that everyone could sense but no one dare name out loud. And then came the announcement that stunned the world. Germany and the Soviet Union, two powers built on opposing ideologies, each openly despising the other, had signed a non-aggression pact. The agreement was named after the two foreign ministers who put their signatures to it, Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviet Union and Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany. But behind those names stood two figures whose relationship was built entirely on mutual suspicion and calculated deception: Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. On the surface, the pact declared that neither country would attack the other. To the rest of the world, it seemed like political theater, absurd, even impossible. How could a fascist regime and a communist, one, form any kind of alliance? Their propaganda machines had spent years demonizing one another. But what the world didn't know was that the treaty contained secret clauses. Hidden beneath the diplomatic language was a map of Eastern Europe carved up between the two powers. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland were to be divided according to agreed spheres of influence. Civilizations partitioned like portions at a table where only the hungriest were invited. Hitler did not sign this agreement because he respected Stalin or because he had abandoned his ideology. He signed it because he needed time. Since the early 1920s, he had been explicit in his writing and his speeches about two things: his hatred of communism and his desire to conquer living space in the East, what he called Lebensraum. But to pursue that ambition, he first needed to secure his western flank. He could not fight on two fronts simultaneously. Not yet. On September 1st, 1939, exactly 1 week after the pact was signed, the German military crossed the Polish border. Tanks rolled, cities burned, and the lightning war the world had never seen before announced itself with terrifying efficiency. 2 days later, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. The spiral had begun. Hitler had bought himself exactly what he wanted: freedom to strike westward without fear of Soviet interference on his eastern border. But in doing so, he had also planted a ticking explosive beneath his own empire. Because the pact with Stalin was never meant to last. It was a temporary tool, a calculated lie. And like all lies built on contempt, it would eventually explode. And when it did, it would take everything with it. The word that would define the early years of the war was blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was not just a tactic. It was a philosophy of violence. Fast-moving armored divisions supported by aircraft, punching through enemy lines before defenders could react, encircling entire armies, collapsing defenses that had taken years to build in a matter of days. And it worked with devastating, almost theatrical speed. Norway and Denmark fell. Then, on May 10th, 1940, Hitler launched his Western offensive. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg crumbled within days. France, considered one of the most powerful military forces on the continent, protected by the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, lasted just over 5 weeks. On June 14th, 1940, German soldiers marched into Paris. The city fell silent. Only the sound of boots on cobblestones echoed through streets that had once celebrated liberation. A swastika flag was raised above the Eiffel Tower. Hitler flew to Paris the following morning, stepping out of his aircraft with the calm satisfaction of a man who believed history had simply done what he had always known it would. Europe appeared to be his, but one island refused to cooperate. In London, a new prime minister had just taken power, a man whose entire being seemed built for the singular task of refusing to surrender. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament not with reassurance, but with something rawer and far more durable: defiance. He promised blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And then he added that Britain would never surrender. Hitler needed to cross the English Channel to finish the job. But to do that, he first had to own the sky. And so began the Battle of Britain. For months through the summer and autumn of 1940, German aircraft crossed the Channel in massive formations, targeting ports, factories, and civilian neighborhoods in an attempt to break British will. London burned night after night. Families slept in underground stations. But the pilots of the Royal Air Force, many barely 20 years old, flying 4 missions a day, refused to yield. Churchill described their sacrifice in a sentence that would outlive everyone who heard it. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The Luftwaffe lost aircraft faster than it could replace them. By the autumn of 1940, Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion of the United Kingdom, was quietly shelved. It was the first time the German war machine had been stopped. Not destroyed, not crippled, simply stopped. And so, rather than consolidate and reconsider, Hitler did what men with unchecked power so often do. He opened another door. At dawn on June 22, 1941, more than 3.5 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military invasion in the history of warfare. The operation had a name that reflected Hitler's belief in his own mythological destiny: Operation Barbarossa. The logic, in Hitler's mind, was sound. His army had crushed Poland in weeks. France had fallen in a month. Why would the Soviet Union be any different? His generals promised the campaign would be finished in 3 months. The Red Army, he believed, was a hollow force. Its best commanders purged by Stalin in the late 1930s, its equipment outdated, its morale fragile. In the opening weeks, it seemed like he might be right. German armored divisions under commanders like General Heinz Guderian tore through Soviet defenses with ferocious speed. Entire Soviet army groups were surrounded and destroyed. Minsk fell, then Smolensk, then Kiev. In just the first months of the campaign, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers had been captured. The speed of the German advance was genuinely staggering, and German commanders began calculating how many weeks remained until Moscow. But underneath the surface of these stunning victories, the structural flaws of Hitler's plan were already becoming visible to those with eyes to see them. Germany did not have sufficient fuel to sustain a campaign of this scale. Its supply lines stretched thinner with every kilometer gained. The roads were primitive, dirt tracks that became rivers of mud at the first rain. And the Soviet Union was not France. It was something closer to a continent, and its people were willing to sacrifice in ways no German strategist had accounted for. Stalin recovered from the shock of the invasion and issued orders of brutal clarity: destroy everything before retreating. Crops, bridges, factories, livestock. Nothing was to be left for the Germans. The scorched earth policy turned vast territories into wastelands. And then Hitler made the decision that military historians consider his greatest strategic error of the war. Instead of concentrating force on Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union, he split his armies in 3 directions: north toward Leningrad, south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and only then, too late and too weakened, toward the capital. His generals argued against it. He dismissed them with contempt. The autumn rains arrived. Soviet roads became impassable. Tanks sank to their axles. Artillery had to be dragged by horses. The blitzkrieg, which depended entirely on speed, simply stopped. Then winter hit, temperatures down to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Weapons froze. Engines would not start. Soldiers equipped for a 3-month summer campaign stood, without winter clothing, in conditions that would have tested the hardiest men alive. Hitler's response was to blame his generals. Not one step back, he ordered. He dismissed experienced commanders and replaced them with ideological loyalists. Meanwhile, the Soviets adapted proper gear, Siberian troops, equipment designed for exactly this cold. In December 1941, they counterattacked outside Moscow. The German advance stopped, then reversed. For the first time in the war, the German army retreated. The myth of invincibility had cracked. What Hitler did not know was that the Soviet Union was rebuilding itself beyond the Ural Mountains. Stalin had ordered the evacuation of Soviet industrial capacity on a scale without precedent. More than 1,500 factories dismantled, loaded onto trains, and reassembled thousands of kilometers east beyond the reach of German bombers. Workers built in the snow. Production began before roofs were finished. By mid-1942, the relocated factories were already producing T-34 tanks and aircraft in quantities Germany could not match. At the same time, the United States sent massive quantities of supplies to both Great Britain and the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. More than 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, and millions of tons of fuel and food. America's industry, untouched by bombing and running at full capacity, fed the Allied war machine like a furnace that never went cold. Germany, by contrast, was running out of everything. The war had shifted from a contest of maneuver to a contest of production, and that was a war Germany was destined to lose. But Hitler's most catastrophic decision was still ahead. In the summer of 1942, he launched Operation Blue, a massive southern offensive to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and take Stalingrad, the industrial city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's name. For Hitler, the city had become personal. Taking it would humiliate his enemy on the world stage. German bombers reduced Stalingrad to rubble, but the rubble made it impossible to capture. Ruins of factories became fortresses. Broken concrete became perfect cover for defenders and death traps for the tanks that gave Germany its edge. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus advanced house by house, room by room. Soviet soldiers fought in small groups, appearing out of nowhere, striking, then vanishing. Hitler forbade any withdrawal. He had staked his prestige on this city, and no military reality would change his mind. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Rather than fighting inside the city, they had quietly assembled massive forces on both flanks, defended by Romanian and Italian units that were less equipped and less motivated. The attack came simultaneously from both sides. Within days, the pincers closed. More than 300,000 German soldiers, the entire Sixth Army, were surrounded. Paulus begged Hitler for permission to break out. Hitler refused. He promised aerial resupply that never came. Men ate horses than rats. On February 2nd, 1943, Paulus surrendered. Of the 300,000 men encircled, roughly 90,000 survived to become prisoners. Very few ever returned to Germany. Stalingrad was the turning point of the war. From that day forward, Germany would never again hold the initiative on the Eastern Front. Desperate to prove the German army still had its offensive power, Hitler ordered one final attack in the east, Operation Citadel, targeting a Soviet salient near Kursk. More than 900,000 soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft were assembled. But the Soviets knew every detail of the plan. They built the most extensive defensive system of the war, layer upon layer of trenches, minefields, and anti-tank positions extending over 200 kilometers deep. When the Germans attacked on July 5, 1943, armor drove in a field so densely mined that columns were torn apart before reaching the main lines. At Prokhorovka, approximately 800 tanks collided in a battle so close that guns could barely aim. German losses were catastrophic and irreplaceable. After less than 2 weeks, Hitler called off the offensive. The German armed forces would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, Germany only retreated. While the Eastern Front consumed German strength, the wider war was closing in from every direction. In North Africa, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been stopped at El Alamein in October 1942 by British forces under General Bernard Montgomery. American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria the following month. Trapped between two Allied fronts, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. Losses comparable to Stalingrad. Churchill summed up El Alamein with a line that became famous. Before El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat. From North Africa, the Allies struck Sicily in July 1943. The island fell within weeks, and the political collapse in Italy was immediate. Mussolini was removed from power on July 25th and arrested. Hitler rescued him in a daring commando raid, but the rescue changed nothing. Italy split in two, south under Allied control, north under German occupation. Adding a third front Germany could not afford to sustain. From the skies, Allied bombers struck Germany around the clock. Americans by day, the British Royal Air Force by night. Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Berlin were reduced to rubble. The bombing of Hamburg in July 1943 alone killed more than 40,000 civilians in a single week. At sea, British intelligence had broken the German naval code, and new radar systems turned the tide against German submarines. In 5 months of 1943, Germany lost more than 250 submarines. The Atlantic, which Germany had hoped would strangle Allied supply lines, became instead a graveyard for its own fleet. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare began. Operation Overlord, the Allied landing in Normandy, put more than 5,000 vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and over 150,000 soldiers across the English Channel in a single day. 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, were the targets. At Omaha, where German defenses were strongest, American soldiers faced machine gun fire and artillery from the moment the ramps dropped. The casualties were catastrophic. The sea ran red, but they did not stop. By the end of that day, the Allies had a foothold in France. Hitler, convinced that Normandy was a feint and the real invasion was still coming further east, refused to release his Panzer Armored divisions until it was too late. The beachhead solidified. By August, Allied forces had broken out across France. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The German commander responsible for the city, General Dietrich von Colditz, ignored Hitler's order to destroy it and surrendered intact, a microcosm of what the entire final phase of the war would look like. Hitler demanding destruction, and reality refusing to comply. As 1944 ended and 1945 began, the Third Reich was being compressed from all directions. Soviet forces had liberated most of Eastern Europe and were pushing into Germany from the east. American, British, and French forces had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing from the west. German cities were falling almost daily. The Luftwaffe barely existed as an effective fighting force. German fuel supplies had collapsed. Soldiers were fighting with weapons they lacked the ammunition to fire properly. Hitler retreated into an underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin and refused to leave. In that shelter, surrounded by loyal subordinates and cut off from any accurate understanding of reality, he spent the final weeks of the war issuing commands to armies that existed only on maps. Units that had been destroyed, divisions that had surrendered or simply ceased to function as organized forces. He blamed his generals for every failure. He blamed the German people themselves for proving unworthy of his vision. He blamed fate and treachery and weakness. He never blamed himself. On April 20th, 1945, his 56th birthday, Soviet artillery began the final bombardment of Berlin. Officers who came to pay their respects found a man who had aged a decade in a year, bent, trembling, his left hand shaking uncontrollably. He still spoke about miracle weapons and relief armies that would turn the tide. No one believed him anymore. On April 25th, Soviet and American forces met at the Elbe River, physically cutting Germany in two. Berlin was completely surrounded. Soviet infantry fought through its streets block by block. The Reichstag, symbol of German parliamentary power, was one of the final objectives. On April 30th, 1945, in his office inside the bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself. His companion Eva Braun took cyanide beside him. Their bodies were carried to the garden of the Chancellery and burned, as Hitler had instructed. In the hours that followed, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, one of the last true believers, poisoned his 6 children and then died alongside his wife. On May 2nd, Soviet forces captured the Reichstag and raised a red flag above its ruins. On May 8th, German military commanders signed the instruments of unconditional surrender. The Second World War in Europe was over. The man who had promised a 1,000-year empire had delivered 12 years of catastrophe. The continent he had set out to dominate lay in ruins. Tens of millions of people were dead. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others, had been revealed in all its industrial horror as Allied soldiers liberated the concentration camps and found the ovens, the mass graves, the survivors who looked like the living dead. The lessons of how Hitler lost are not difficult to identify in retrospect. He opened a war on 2 fronts simultaneously, something German military strategists had identified as potentially fatal since the First World War. He overestimated the speed with which the Soviet Union could be defeated and underestimated the depth of Soviet endurance. He split his forces at critical moments when concentration would have been decisive. He dismissed experienced professional soldiers and replaced strategic thinking with ideological obsession. He governed through terror, which meant that honest assessments of the military situation were suppressed in favor of telling him what he wanted to hear. And behind all of these specific errors lay the deepest flaw of all. He believed that his will alone could bend reality. That desire was a substitute for logistics. That courage could replace fuel. That belief was more powerful than material facts. Reality disagreed, and reality won. From the rubble of Berlin to the frozen fields of Stalingrad, from the beaches of Normandy to the skies above burning German cities, the Second World War was decided not by one battle, not by one moment, but by the accumulated weight of choices, sacrifices, and the unstoppable force of millions of ordinary people who refused to stop fighting. Hitler's empire did not fall because of luck. It fell because it was built on hatred, on lies, and on the belief that one man's will could override the laws of reality. History does not bend to tyrants. It outlasts them, always. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of those battles, those decisions, and those lives, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the histories that shaped our world. Every week, we bring you stories that go beyond the headlines, stories that demand to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us which chapter of history you want to explore next. We read every single one.